The AC Podcast is back, reloaded again, picking up with a special Eagles edition podcast, of course. Like I've outlined before, these things tend to take a while, so buckle up. We've got a long ride ahead. And it's as I outlined on part 1 and 2 of Dysfunctional, Disgrace, Discombobulated. This franchise continues to do things that are just mind-boggling. And the defense of this stuff is even more idiotic and insulting to the fan base. It's really hard to stomach that these people actually think they're running a competent operation right now. It is really just so disheartening and flagrantly insulting that the owner in his press conference after he fired Doug Pederson can make the statements that he made. But so we're going to get in. We got a lot to get into. Jeffrey Lurie, the owner, I have to get into him because what he's done and what he's doing and what he is oblivious to, it's running this franchise into the ground and they have no direction at all. Howie Roseman, I have to get into him. And I have to get into Doug, Carson's future, potential head coaching candidates, the whole nine. There's just a lot of angles to get. So, like I said, buckle up. But I just got to start with Howie Roseman. I've talked about this guy ad nauseum. I've gotten on him. I've questioned everything. And this guy deserves to be fired. There's just no other way to slice it. You cannot convince me otherwise. But this guy, he's a real weasel, man. This guy and his self-preserving, slimy behind. And people are like, oh, AC, how could you come on this podcast and character assassinate him and all this other stuff? Well, number one, it's my podcast. And number two, let's just talk about all the leaks that have come out of this Eagles organization in the last month. You talk about Carson Wentz was going to request a trade at the end of the season. And he didn't want to be a backup, but that didn't come from his agent or him. Carson Wentz hasn't even spoken to the media since the season ended. You talk about the relationship between Doug and Carson being fractured. You talk about the Doug Pederson, quote unquote, not being on firm ground with the owner. You talk about his coaching decisions and his coaching staff, you know, hirings and all these other things being leaked. And then you talk about just you talk about how they did the whole firing. It was just a terrible operation from the neck down. This is just a failing operation at so many levels. It's just mind-boggling how they've run this franchise into the ground. And it just seems like there's no way out right now except to pray. But Howie Roseman, it's really just appalling that no one can see through this guy. No one can see through what he's feeding the national media. It's real funny how every time he gets criticized for something, the national media finds a way to criticize Doug or Carson Wentz. And here's how beautifully Howie Roseman has spun this, because the local media in Philadelphia is not fooled by this. Notice how they don't leak anything to them. It's always to the national media. Howie Roseman has spun this to where, regardless of whether they kept Doug or Carson, he's going to skate free. He used Carson as a human shield, leaking stuff on game days, on Sundays, and back-to-back weeks after Jalen Hurts was starting to make him look like a selfish guy, a bad teammate, and he was getting labeled soft. Now, when that stopped working and Jalen Hurts starts losing, what then did he do? What then did Howie Roseman leak? He leaked Doug Pederson not being on firm ground with the owner and that he had a meeting. But here's the confusing part about all this. Why the day after the season did you, as the owner, because I don't believe Jeffrey Lurie wanted to fire Doug Pederson. Because if he did, Why didn't he do that at the end of the season? Why did he send Howie Roseman and Doug Pederson out together promoting unity in front of the organization to have press conferences in unity over a live video call? So that's the first thing. But then for some reason, a week later, Jeffrey Lurie comes to the conclusion that he has these meetings with Doug Pederson. Now all of a sudden he's not on firm ground with the owner, and the owner's thinking about firing him. And at that point, when that report came out, I'm like, oh, Doug's gone. Because what could you possibly say that's going to ease the owner's mind at that point? If you're not on, standing on solid ground with them already, what do you think? Another meeting is going to change that? And so when we hear these reports about that, now what Howie Roseman has done since Doug is fired is instead of Carson Wentz being the human shield, now Carson Wentz is labeled the villain because now he's a coach killer. Now people are of the assumption that the Eagles are going to keep Carson Wentz now because because the relationship was, because the article was leaked and the information was leaked that the relationship was quote unquote fractured between Carson Wentz and Doug Pederson. So now that someone had to be the fall guy. In this case, it was Doug, because it's hard to trade a quarterback that you committed over $100 million to, and you're going to have to take a $34.6 million cap hit to trade. So naturally, yes, there's no, ramifications on your salary cap for firing the head coach. So it makes sense. But now Carson Wentz is going to be labeled the coach killer, and it looks like the Eagles chose the quarterback over the coach, which is far from the truth, which I'm going to get into later. But you look at all that, and it's just like, yo, Howie Roseman, he just saves his neck at every turn. He saves it at every turn, because now look what they're going to do. Remember, before the reports were leaked about Carson Wentz wanting a trade from the Philadelphia Eagles because of promises that weren't kept in this whole Jalen Hurts situation. Now what the Eagles are going to be able to do, since Doug is fired now, is they're going to be able to salvage the relationship somehow. And they're going to leak reports about that, how the relationship just needed some fixing and there were problems, but we fixed it. And now it's going to look salvageable. But in the background, Carson Wentz is still going to be labeled a coach killer. And if he doesn't play well, then what happens? Now Carson Wentz is the fall guy, and Howie Roseman skates free yet again, skates free of all culpability and accountability. So he's spun those narratives and leaked that information. And they're like, how do you know he's leaking it to the national media? Yo, come on now, man. We haven't heard anything from Carson. Doug's only spoken to the media a handful of times. Who else could be getting this information? How is the national media getting this information if it's not Carson, it's not his agent, and it's not Doug? And Howie Roseman is tipping these dudes off. If you give high profile national media people tips and scoops, they'll do favors for you, a la not excoriate your name in the public. And instead you give them information and inside scoops about Carson and Doug and what's going on with them. Then you get to skate free, absolved of all blame. And instead on the national TV shows, instead of them talking about you and your mishaps as a GM, guess what they're talking about instead? The drama between Carson Wentz and Doug, and how Doug's a Super Bowl winning head coach, and how could they think to get rid of him instead of Carson? And oh, Carson, he's a soft guy. He's not a locker room guy. He's selfish. How could he leak this information? Him and his representation, even though they have no evidence of that. How could they leak this information on Jalen Hurts' first start or his second start of the game? Then they're talking about that stuff. And Howie Roseman is like, yep, he just walks in the office and sits down in his comfortable chair and puts his feet up on the table and escapes all accountability. So that's how I know it's Howie Roseman leaking the information. Because think about it. When has Carson Wentz ever not talked to the media? When has he ever been a guy that hasn't been of high standing character? When? We can't think of a time. We can't. Because it's never happened. So now you're going to have me believe all of the sudden Carson Wentz is this uncompromising guy, this selfish guy, this guy who runs and leaks information because he's not getting his way, this guy who looks like a brat because he got benched, when all you hear from people, or rather his teammates, is he's taking it like a champ. He doesn't like the situation, but he's helping Jalen Hurts. You see footage on the sidelines of him helping Jalen Hurts. Why would I believe that all of the sudden this high character guy has turned into a jerk? Why? What evidence do I have of that? But we have plenty of evidence on Howie Roseman and his self-preservation tactics. This is the same guy that survived 3 power struggles. Survived a power struggle with Chip Kelly, one with Joe Banner. Now he survived another one with Doug Pederson. I mean, give me a break. So there's that. Then you look at this from the Doug angle, and like I said before, I believe Doug should have been fired. I believe it. I'm sorry. I know that's not what people want to hear. It's like, oh, how could you fire the coach after 5 seasons and he wanted you a Super Bowl 3 seasons ago and 2 or in 3 straight playoff appearances and whatnot. But here's how I see how this whole situation went down. So Jeffrey Lurie had, his meeting with Doug and, all that. And so Jeffrey Lurie was unpleased with Doug Pederson because he wanted Doug Pederson to bring in some fresh, innovative offensive minds, and Doug Pederson wanted to promote from within. So basically, Jeffrey Lurie asked what Doug Peterson's vision was for the team. He said he was going to promote Press Taylor to offensive coordinator, from quarterbacks coach and pass game analyst to offensive coordinator. He was going to promote Andrew Briner from pass game analyst to QB coach. He was going to promote Matt Burke from D-line coach to defensive coordinator, or bring in ex-DBs coach Corey Undlin as defensive coordinator, the guy who was just the defensive coordinator with the Detroit Lions for Matt Patricia. Those were Doug's plans, and he also wanted to retain Dave Phipp as the special teams coach. So Lurie was underwhelmed by Doug's candidates and wanted some external hires. And that's where the rift was caused. So let's break this down for a second, because this is really amusing to me. This has a lot right here before we even proceed. So let me get this straight. Doug, you can make an argument. Well, no, Doug, first off, should have control over his own coaching staff. I'm not here to argue that. He should, but there's an argument that he shouldn't, and I'm going to get to that in a second. And then I'm going to give you guys some, numbers. So the argument for Doug having his own coaching staff is he's won a Super Bowl. And for some odd reason, the Eagles have never empowered Doug Pederson as the head coach, despite the fact that he won the Super Bowl. Coming into his coaching tenure, they brought in these guys. They brought in Jim Schwartz. They retained Dave Phipp. He was there from the Chip Kelly era. And basically, the majority of his coaching staff was assembled. So they brought in Jim Schwartz, and let him be the head coach of defense before they even hired Doug Pederson. So he didn't have a say over who he wanted as defensive coordinator. So that was a problem right there. But, they won a Super Bowl, not because of Jim Schwartz's defense in the Super Bowl. Although the Super Bowl run, his defense was good, but not in the Super Bowl. They gave up 33. I mean, give me a break. They had to score 41 to win. But you look at that, and you look at Doug Pederson and his offense, or rather his offensive coaching staff, and you didn't give him power over his own coaching staff after he won the Super Bowl. This guy won the Super Bowl, not you. He was out there coaching. So you can make that argument that Doug Pederson, he was very disrespected in the sense of he didn't have control over his own coaching staff. And so I can understand why he'd want to promote from within. And those were his answers because those are the guys that he wanted, as a part of his staff. Doug Pederson's loyal. But the argument against Doug Pederson is this. And let me go back for a second. Because part of the problem was last offseason when Doug Pederson said Carson Walsh, the wide receivers coach, and Mike Groh, when he said those two were coming back and then 2 days later they got fired, he had to announce they were fired. It sent mixed signals. Clearly that was, a decision from the higher ups. Howie Roseman and Jeffrey Lurie wanted him to get some fresh ideas because his offense had regressed, obviously. So there's that. And of course, Doug Peterson became frustrated with that. And there's reports that he threatened to quit after that. So there was that whole spiel. There was other reports, obviously, that Howie Roseman and Doug Peterson increasingly didn't see eye to eye on personnel decisions. And Doug made comments earlier before he was fired nearing the end of the season that he'd like more, say in the personnel decisions as well. So it makes sense because you're the head coach and you have a certain scheme, or you certain players that you want. Of course, you'd want, say, to run your offensive system. You need players to run. You want the players that you want so you can run your offensive system. So that makes sense. So, I don't have any problem with that. But the argument against that is this. Your offense had gotten stale at the end of 2019. Carson Wentz had to carry a bunch of practice squad players to the playoffs. You had the Carson Walsh, the wide receivers coach, who was praising guys for aligning right and assigning right instead of catching the football. And you had Mike Groh, who was offering you nothing as far as an offensive coordinator. So you can make an argument that they should have been fired, and it is what it is. But clearly that created a rift, and you can see either side of that coin. Then you fast forward to this year. Doug Pearson didn't choose his staff. Howie Roseman brought in Rich Scangarello, who they didn't rehire, who they got rid of or let his contract expire. And then he brought in Marty Morningwig. Those were Howie Roseman decisions, and they let their contracts expire. And then they fired Doug Peterson. So it seems like Doug walked into the meeting with Jeffrey Lurie and said, it's either my way or the highway. And here's what I think. It was one of two things, because let me give you the numbers on this ridiculous proposal that Doug Peterson was doing. Let me break down these coaching hires that he was trying to incorporate onto his coaching staff, because they were mind boggling to me. You're talking about Press Taylor, right? So Press Taylor, the Eagles passing offense under Press Taylor was the fourth worst pass offense in DVOA, second worst passer rating, worst average yards per pass, worst completion percentage, and had the most turnovers. So why in the hell would I let you promote him? Let's add more context to the Eagles offense overall, because the Eagles offense has regressed the last 3 seasons since they've won the Super Bowl under Doug Peterson. For those who are saying, because my opinion is Doug Peterson has been he's been caught up to as far as his scheming, as far as his offensive scheme, and it's become stale and plain. That's my opinion. So let's look at the Pro Football Focus offensive rankings. 30th overall, 30th in passing, 32nd in receiving, 26th in rushing, 15th in pass blocking, 17th in run blocking. Then when you look at the team passer rating, it was ranked 31st. The Eagles passing offense. Team passer rating, 31st. Team completion percentage, 32nd. Team yards per attempt, 32nd. Touchdown passes, 24th. Interceptions, 31st. Percentage of pass attempts resulting in first down, 31st. Pass plays of 20 plus yards, 24th. And sacks allowed, 32nd. Oh, give me a break. You need some fresh ideas in here. I can see why the owner wasn't allowing you to have some internal promotions. Because of this? You want to promote Press Taylor and these were the numbers with you and him? And then you talk about the other numbers that I just named, the pass offense under this guy with you and him at the helm? Why am I inclined to believe that you don't need any external hires? This is a joke. But I believe Doug Peterson put his foot down in the meeting and said, like I said, it's my way or the highway. So you have that. But here's my other thing. Because there was reports that Doug Peterson would have minded being fired earlier that came out in the season. And so here's my other thing, or here's my other guess. Either A, he actually thought these were good decisions to make, and he was putting his foot down to demand control over his coaching staff. Or B, this was self-sabotage. So he could get the heck up out of Philadelphia because he knew he could get a job elsewhere, which I can't blame him for. I can't blame him for it. I don't like the way that this went down. This was unorganized because, and this is what I mean, because this couldn't have been, this decision just had so much, no direction, no planning to it as far as the whole thing's concerned. And this is where I come back to the owner. This is exactly where I come back to the owner. Because if you're an owner and you're skipping games, the Browns game, because you're clearly frustrated about the operation that you're in, the product that your team is putting out on the field, how can you not be in tune enough to know whether or not you want to keep this head coach? You wait until a week later until you have meetings with him after you sent him out in front of the organization with Howie Roseman in a video conference the day after the season is over to promote unity, essentially. And then a week later, you're firing the guy. Did you not know whether you wanted to fire the guy? That's my thing. You didn't know that you needed to fire the guy until afterwards. This is unorganized. This isn't. Think about the message that sends. You send the day after the last game of the season, you send out the GM and the head coach in a press conference together. Then a week later, promoting unity and essentially saying that these are going to be the guys going into next season. Then a week later, you fire the guy. And I don't believe Howie Roseman actually had anything to do with this one. I don't believe he had any direct involvement because this was just a meeting between him and the owner. I believe because Howie was sitting there right next to Doug. He didn't care. But at this point, I'm just looking at it and I'm looking at the owner and I'm just like, yo, this guy, he doesn't know what he's doing. Jeffrey Lurie, and the way Eagles did, and the way they did that was shameful. That was shameful to the fans, and it was shameful to Doug. I don't like the way that they just did this whole operation. It's embarrassing. These guys, they don't do business right. These are businessmen. They can't do business right. So why in the heck would I trust you as far as knowing how to win games and get this organization back to winning? Because I got to get to his comments in a minute, but my problem is this, because they're like, well, you got what you wanted. Why are you mad? It's how you did it. You go out and you promote unity, and then a week later you're firing the guy? What message are you sending? Like, what is that? And then to go before that, why didn't you know you wanted to fire the guy before after the season was over when teams normally fire guys? Why didn't you know then? You watched 16 games of this and you were going to run it back until, quote unquote, you and Doug disagreed about the direction of the team and external hires and long-term versus short-term? That's when you decided to fire him? Not after the 16 game sample size that you had when the team went 4-11-1? Like, what are you watching? It's like, what is this owner watching? What could you have possibly seen? What did you see for 16 games that told you that you needed to run this operation back with the coach, owner, with the coach, the GM, and the quarterback? What told you that? How could you come to those conclusions? And that's what I mean. This organization, they have no foresight. They're running to a tunnel with no light at the end of it. I outlined it on part 2 of discombobulation. The GM has no foresight. He couldn't foresee the decline and downfall of this roster until changes were going to have to be inevitable. You don't get to the point where you have to make changes that are inevitable unless you have no foresight, unless you make mistake after mistake after mistake. And how can you box yourself into that corner repeatedly? How? How do you do that? The two most important people right now that are running the Eagles organization, they don't know what they're doing. The owner, he has no clue what he's doing. And the GM is being backed up by the owner, not being held accountable. And as the fans, we're supposed to feel confident about this operation going forward? Come on, man. Like, give me a break with these guys. This is a joke. It's just unheard. Like, this is unprecedented stuff. These dudes, they have to, instead of moving on from Doug, they have to make everything personal and dysfunctional by leaking information about the guy's coaching staff plans to make him look bad on the way out. It's disgraceful. It's shameful how these guys do business. It's shameful. They're meddling in things they don't know, and they don't know what they're doing. They just don't. These guys, you can't make an argument these guys don't know what they're doing. Or you can't make an argument these guys know what they're doing. How could you? Where's the evidence the last 3 years? Let me get to this owner. Because some of these answers, he actually believes the stuff that he's saying. He's so out of touch with the fan base and the city that he actually believes the stuff that he's saying. It is mind-boggling. I sat back when I listened to his press conference. I'm like, this is one naive billionaire. I thought billionaires were supposed to be smart. But this guy, he's naive. He's oblivious. Like, what are like these answers? They just don't make sense. So we get to this first thing. The first of many ridiculous things that the owner says. The first of it being he gets asked a question about Doug and his job, and here's his response. Did Doug deserve to be let go? No. No, he did not deserve to be let go. Huh? What do you mean? You fired the guy. You fired the guy and then you say he didn't deserve to be let go? Then why'd you fire him? It was because we disagreed about the long term and the short term of the team. You know, Doug's a guy who's going to want to, try to maximize 2021. So you're firing the guy for wanting to win? The main criteria of a coach's job to win? So what you want him to say he's going to throw games next season because you want to start investing in the young and start investing in getting some youthful players on this team? You want to now invest in the mid and long term of the team and not the short term? What are you talking about? It doesn't make a bit of sense. Did Doug deserve to be let go? No, he did not deserve to be let go, but you fired him. What? What are you talking about? That makes no sense. Like, why? Oh my goodness. This is maddening. But we have to continue. Then he gets asked a question about Howie Roseman and his GM skills. And he says, this is what he says. This really blew my mind. We have about 5 people in our organization that right now I could project that would be general managers in this league. What are you talking about? What? How do you have 5 guys who project to be general managers in this league and your roster is bereft of talent and your 4 wins? If any of these 5 people that you were mentioning were competent at their jobs, this team would not be 4-11-1. What are you talking about? And what good is that if you can't evaluate talent on your roster? To get talent on your roster, rather. What good is having five projected GMs if you can't evaluate talent? What are you talking about? So what are you giving him credit for? Being surrounded by a bunch of brilliant personnel minds and still not drafting well? So what are you grading this guy? What is his job? You're grading him on the staff he assembles to make bad picks year after year after year? I've never heard something so absurd. Like, what is that? I just don't get, like... Well, what is it? This reminds me of the quarterback factory quote from Howie Roseman. What do you think you guys are, a GM factory? Andrew Berry spent 8 years with the Colts before he spent 2 years with you. You didn't develop him, despite the fact that he was poached from your organization. The Colts developed him, not you. What are you talking about? Like, what is this? I don't get this stuff. It's just idiotic this is the owner speaking. This doesn't make any sense. Let's get to his next quote. I think 1/4 of the time I've been owner in the last 20 years, we've appeared in an NFC championship game. That's hard to do without really good talent. Another defense of the GM and his lack of drafting. What are you talking about? You've been... Yes, you've been to many NFC championship games, but those are with Donovan McNabb and Andy Reid in 2001, 2002, 2003, 2004, and 2008. That was before Howie Roseman was the GM. What are you talking about? He was the GM in 2010. He's only been to one NFC championship game. What are you talking about? All this success in with really good talent. That was before Howie Roseman started picking the groceries. What are you talking about? Here he goes again with another idiotic quote. And these quotes, they just insult the fan base and our intelligence. And it's mind-boggling. Here's another quote. If we are identifying the best players, but they get taken 2, 3, 4, 5 picks ahead of us, that's also part of the evaluation. Oh my gosh. What in the hell are you talking about? What in the hell are you talking about? Your job is to get players and draft players when you pick. What are you talking about? The people that you identified, and part of your process of evaluating the success of the GM is the fact that you evaluated dudes that were picked 4 or 5 picks ahead of you. Your job is to pick the best player available with the pick you have, not evaluate other teams and the success they're having with their draft picks. How the hell can you be successful when you're busy looking at everybody else's lane? Too busy comparing yourself to the rest of the league. What are you talking about? Every team has a player pick 2, 3, 4 picks ahead of them. It's what the hell you have a draft board for. What? That doesn't make any damn sense. Part of identifying the best, if we are identifying the best players, but they get taken 2, 3, 4, 5 picks ahead? What about all the players you've missed on, that you passed on? What about them? The only team that gets the player they want every year is the team that has the number 1 pick. After that, everyone else has to wait until another team picks. What about the talent that's fallen to you that you've missed on, that you haven't drafted? What are you talking about? The whole idea of the draft is to pick the best player when you pick. You're too busy looking at the success of other draft picks with other teams, and you're not even evaluating your own GM for the gaps that he's routinely had in the draft with the players that he's picking. But a part of the process is, oh, well, he evaluated that the 4 or 5 guys that went before the guy that we took are good, so that means he's a good GM. What? You're only judged based off of the guys that you pick, not the guys that other teams pick. You're not the GM of those other teams. What are you talking? Like, this is stupid. This doesn't make a bit of sense. It doesn't make a bit of sense. This doesn't make sense at all. These guys, like, this is an unqualified owner. He's just unqualified. It's just because then at one point in the press conference, he's comparing the Eagles and their downfall to Seattle and Atlanta when they went to the Super Bowls. And I'm trying to figure, that's because they drafted poorly and they fell off. So you want to be like those organizations? Isn't the point to have sustainability? What are you like? Oh my gosh, this owner, he's completely oblivious and absolves Howie Roseman from all accountability. He's had 5 terrible drafts in a row to the point. How do you look at how is part of your evaluation process the fact that, oh, you look at the players that you could have had that were drafted ahead of you, but you don't evaluate the players that you do have that are currently on your roster. And you also don't evaluate the fact that you are 4-11-1 right now because you don't have good players on the roster. And that comes back to the GM. How can you sit there and absolve him from all accountability like that? How? Because he says this nonsense. If you look at it in a complex way, I will match our performance against any other organization and know it is because there is good talent. When you're a veteran team, you are not going to have starters from the draft. Well, no, duh. You're not going to have starters from the draft if you're not drafting well. Of course, you're going to invest in veterans because you're not drafting well. The dudes you drafted are unable or are not competent enough to usurp the dudes and the veterans that are on the roster that probably aren't good either. What are you talking about? Oh, my gosh. He even says other quotes. If you look at a long period, you are going to see highs and lows with draft struggles, highs and lows with free agency. I have to be much more in depth with the analysis. There were mistakes made. We need to improve. I am not a person who is satisfied. The last 5 years, you haven't drafted anybody meaningful. Your last 50 picks, you drafted one Pro Bowl player, and it's the guy that was trying that you leaked reports about that wanted to request a trade, Carson Wentz. You haven't drafted a defensive Pro Bowler since 2013, and you haven't drafted a defensive Pro Bowler outside of the first round since Trent Cole. That was 15 years ago. What are you talking about? And the free agency gaps, how many do we need to name? Javon Hargrave, Nickel Roby Coleman, Zach Brown, Haloti Nada. I mean, give me a break. Come on now, you brought back Jalen Mills. You let go of Malcolm Jenkins. You broke what are these moves? What are you talking about? Your free agent moves haven't worked out the last couple of seasons, which is another reason why this team is not good. So it's like these quotes, they're just mind-boggling. And it shows this franchise, they're not honest with themselves and they have no direction. This is a part of another quote that I've already read, but there have been mistakes. But I have to look most at the process. If we are not identifying the best players, that is part of the process. If we identify but they are taken, we have to look at that too. That quote kind of latches onto the 2, 3, 4, 5 players taken before. That doesn't make any sense. It doesn't. That does not mean just because you identified them that they're not going to get taken. That's why you have a draft board. So you can pivot and have a plan, a counter plan, or a backup plan in case the guy that you want does not fall to you. If you're not evaluating guys that you're choosing with the picks, if you're missing on those guys routinely, why does it matter who gets taken 2, 3, 4 picks ahead of you? The reason we keep getting on higher rows is because of the dudes that he's continuously passed up on that have fallen right to you. If you take a DK Metcalf and Justin Jefferson and Jeremy Chin in the past 2 years, this team would have meaningful players at safety and 2 meaningful wide receivers for the quarterback. Instead, you've taken JJ Arcega-Whiteside, Jalen Reagor, and Jalen Hurts. And you used a 3rd-round pick this year on a project linebacker. You used a 1st-round pick on a left tackle that you didn't even evaluate, and you traded up for him. And you don't know anything about him. He's about to be 3 years into his career. You didn't draft DK Metcalf because of medical concerns, but you fired. But why? How could you trust your medical staff and their flawed procedures when you fired your medical staff the last 3 years? How could you trust their medical reporting when you fired your medical staff the last 3 years? That doesn't make a bit of sense. It doesn't make sense. These dudes, they're just like, even more defensive Howie Roseman. Here he is again. First of all, is the people he surrounds himself with. It is easy to talk about the coach, GM, QB. We have 5 people in our organization that will be GMs in this league. We have a strong nucleus. Why? How do you have a strong nucleus with a bad team? How do you have a strong nucleus in the front office and you can't identify talent and pick players adequately? That's the antithesis of what you just said in their job description. Their job is to evaluate talent and pick players for your team that are supposed to be good. And in the last 5 years, you've picked no one meaningful other than the guy that you undermined and backstabbed, Carson Wentz, and he's the only Pro Bowler. Where are the other meaningful picks at? Where are the other elite players? Where? They're nowhere to be found. Nowhere to be found. Anywhere. How can you sit up here in defense of this foolishness? This owner, he's ran this team into the ground. And it's clear he has a blind spot for the GM. And I don't know what Howie Roseman has on Jeffrey Lurie. I don't know if he's blackmailing him, if he has pictures, but I wish I had job security like Howie Roseman. Because this just doesn't make any sense to me. It doesn't. How on God's green earth could you be this incompetent, this bad, this pathetic at your job and still continue to keep it year after year after year after year? This is unprecedented. This guy is going to be able to pick his 3rd head coach. He's going to be involved in hiring. Howie Roseman is going to be involved in hiring his 3rd head coach, and it'll be his 4th head coach overall. He was there when Andy Reid was there. He was there when Chip Kelly was there. He survived the risk between him and Doug Pederson, and now he's going to get to choose a 3rd head coach and be in the building with a 4th head coach overall. And the last 2 head coaches have had problems with you. Chip Kelly had to send you to the other side of the office. And you and Doug didn't see eye to eye about personnel. Why is it every time a coach comes in here, they have problems with Howie Roseman and Jeffrey Lurie is always absolving him from culpability and accountability? How do you evaluate this guy? He's basically absolved him and said, oh, Howie Roseman's doing a great job. Where? This team is 4-11-1. Where's he done a great job? Where is the evidence? Where? What are you talking about? You're comparing yourself in your process to players that end up on other teams? You're saying that he has 5 projects to have 5 future GMs in the league? It's not just about who we got. It's about the process. What are you talking about? So if you're a fan, how could you feel comfortable about where this franchise is headed? How? Why? They've managed to fire the Super Bowl head coach after not empowering him in some respects. Although there's an argument that they should have had some control over his coaching staff, but there's an argument that Doug Pederson should have had control over his coaching staff as well. He won a Super Bowl. The franchise's one and only Super Bowl. They've managed in 1.5 years to break the franchise quarterback, and some of that is Carson Wentz's fault. But for an organization and a quarterback to fall off this far, everyone has their hand in this pot. So they've managed in 1.5 years after paying the quarterback to break him. They haven't drafted well. They're old, bad, and expensive. And now they're limited in ways they can acquire talent because they're $73 million over the cap for 2021. So your only meaningful way to acquire talent is the draft, which you have been trash at the last half decade. And we're supposed to be comfortable about this operation because you're going to bring in a new head coach? And what if you don't empower him? This is going to be the same sad story. And I've just had enough of it. I'm sorry, but this is mind-boggling. This is really, really mind-boggling. And it really just leads me to one conclusion. The current infrastructure of this organization is broken at the core. This is just dysfunction. You're talking about leaks, people not accepting blame and accountability, deflecting it, self-preservation by the GM, complete and utter denial by the owner, and the lack of accountability by the owner. You just slice this thing so many different ways, and the infrastructure of this thing is just unraveling at the seams. This is beyond disgraceful that we've gotten to this point. It's just beyond unacceptable. This guy Howie Roseman, this franchise, they're being everyone who listens to the national media, you're being bamboozled by Howie Roseman. I'm just letting you know now that this is just unheard of, except if you're the Houston Texans. But this just doesn't make any sense. It just doesn't. Like, how can you make an argument that it does on any level? This is just appalling to me that we're having this discussion right now. And this only really comes back to Howie, and the fans were not fooled by it. The national media and the people that they're disseminating the information to, they're fooled by it. But the fans, we're not fooled by it. We want Howie Roseman up out of here, quick, fast, and in a hurry. But it seems like he's got an everlasting job with the Philadelphia. He's got a lifetime job with the Philadelphia Eagles. He's created this situation. This organization is supposed to be an analytics-driven organization, and yet what are their analytics telling them about the amount of draft picks that they've missed on? Where are their analytics then? This doesn't make any sense. It's the way they're trying to build the team. And then what they do is they try to bamboozle and hoodwink us with this mind-boggling stuff. Jeffrey Lurie makes these statements about the NFC Championship games he gets. I got to go back to that comment for a second, or that quote. The amount of NFC Championship games he's went to. Mind you, 5 of them were with Donovan McNabb and Andy Reid. One of them is with Howie Roseman and Powers, the GM. So I don't know where the hell he thought he was going to fool people with that idiotic statement. But then you have that, and then you couple it with the statements and the lingo that Howie Roseman uses. Oh, we've won 35 games the last 3 years. You lump all that in, and what they're doing is they're masking and overshadowing current failure with past success. Howie Roseman is bringing up the fact that they won 35 games the last 3 years. Bro, you have a losing record since you won the Super Bowl. You're 23, 27, and 1. But what they're doing is they're lumping the Super Bowl year in with these last 2 playoff appearances where they backdoored their way into the playoffs. In 2018, you needed a Chicago Bears team with nothing to play for who had already clinched a playoff berth to beat the Minnesota Vikings, who were in a winning year in situation. And then not only that, you won the playoff game by luck, because that was another thing that Jeffrey Lurie brought up. Oh, we mortgaged the future. We made short-term investments because we wanted to preserve the Super Bowl window in 2018 and 2019. Something else that Howie Roseman said in his exit, or in his press conference after the season ended. Well, a lot of things we did was to preserve the Super Bowl window, and after we won the Super Bowl. And he says, oh, we were an Alshon Jeffrey catch away from the NFC Championship game. Yo, stop bringing that up, number one, because if that you keep saying ifs, well, hold on a second. You didn't even deserve to be in the playoffs. You needed a team to get you. You needed the Chicago Bears with nothing to play for to get you into the playoffs, number one. Number two, you only won that playoff game because of a double doink field goal by Cody Parkey. So you shouldn't even have been in the divisional round to begin with. And then number three, you weren't a good team all year, so you didn't deserve to go to the NFC Championship game. Stop with these ifs. No one cares about if. You didn't do it. You weren't good enough. You didn't make the plays to get there. Stop bringing up stuff like, oh, if he would have caught it, then we would have been. No, you didn't make the plays to get there because you weren't a good team. You didn't out-execute the Saints. So stop bringing up ifs. But what they're doing, and then you factor in 2019 where they backdoored their way into the playoffs because they played in a bad division. Once again, and in this year, you came in last in the worst division in the NFL, one of the worst divisions in NFL history. You only won 4 games. And every other team fired their coaches and their coaching staff, and you were the only one returning your whole entire coach, quarterback, owner, GM. So perceived stability was supposed to be a strength due to this, weird offseason with no OTAs, no mini camp, no training camp type thing. That's supposed to be a perceived, advantage over the other 3 teams in the division. And yet you still came in last. So what the heck does that say about your organization, your infrastructure? Like, what are you talking about? Like, this stuff, it doesn't, what, these like ludicrous statements, they just don't add up. And how can you hold the coach accountable? How can you hold Doug Pederson accountable for the roster that Howie Roseman assembled? So you fire him, but you fire Doug, but you don't fire Howie? Howie's the one that picked this old, bad, and expensive roster and created a quarterback controversy, and you don't fire him as well? Like, how does that make sense? How can you not hold people accountable? This is mind-boggling. And for the people that say, "Oh, well, this was Carson Wentz, he's a coach killer," Jeffrey Lurie in the press conference referenced Carson Wentz and Jalen Hurts as assets. In front office talk, that means they're people that can be traded for value. He didn't even commit to Carson Wentz as the quarterback. Sure, he gave him a few nice quotes and mentions, but he didn't commit to him full on and fixing him. He said it's going to be up to the coach, whoever they hire. Now, of course, there's speculation, and I think the Eagles should be focused on fixing Carson Wentz, but there's speculation that, whoever the coach is, it's going to be someone that, is going to want to fix Carson Wentz and work with him. So there's that. But this doesn't make this is not a well-run franchise. It's not. How do you pay a guy $128 million and then in 1.5 years, you broke the marriage? You've destroyed it to the point where the guy wanted to request a trade. It was untenable between him and the head coach. You managed to do all that in 1.5 years by drafting Jalen Hurts, which once again, for the cajillionth time, for the people who say it was a good pick, no, it was not. No, it was not. All it did was create controversy. The same controversy that Carson Wentz had just gotten up under with Nick Foles when he regained the locker room a year later. He had just gotten out from the quarterback controversy and they reintroduced it into the locker room. Whatever way you slice it, it's a bad pick. If you say that they're doing it to get an adequate backup, why didn't you just get one in free agency? No one drafts backups with high-valued second-round picks. If they're doing it to replace Carson Wentz, you're telling me they had the foresight and the vision. This franchise and this organization, the one that lacks foresight and vision, had the foresight to predict that Carson Wentz was going to fall off to this degree, so they needed to get a backup quarterback. But the part that they didn't account for was where they paid him $128 million, and it would require them taking a $34.6 million cap hit on the second most expensive roster going into 2021. You're telling me this franchise had that foresight? If that's the case, they're idiots. If you're doing it because you want to trade Jalen Hurts, first off, why didn't you just use it on a good player? And then the second part to that is the only way he's going to get you more value than the second round pick is if he plays and plays well, which A means Carson Wentz is injured or he plays so bad that you have to bench him. It's like people are ignorant to what the Eagles have done to Carson Wentz and the struggles that he's went through. First, you get injured during your near MVP season, and you have to watch your backup win the Super Bowl. Then there's a statue outside the stadium every day you go into work, and a guy in the locker room builds a shrine to Nick Foles. Then comes reports about the locker room being split between you and Nick Foles, and people are questioning your leadership. Then Nick Foles leads the team to the playoffs again because you get hurt with a stress fracture in your back that directly is a result of your ACL tear, and people are calling you injury prone, but nonetheless, you miss that. He gets them to the playoffs for a second straight year, or guides them after the season was falling off the rails, wins a playoff game, and then people are still divided in the locker room over you and Nick Foles. Then you have reports, you have Alshon Jeffrey criticize you on two separate occasions to Josina Anderson, and instead of the organization valuing culture instead of a player, they keep Alshon on the roster and guarantee his contract, thus enabling the behavior that if you criticize the franchise quarterback, you will get more money on your contract. And so now you're throwing to a guy that's openly criticized you on two separate occasions, and you're forced to build rapport and chemistry with him, knowing he does not like you. Then you win the locker room back. You get the team to the playoffs with a bunch of scrubs: Robert Davis, Greg Ward, Deontay Burnett, Paul Perkins, and Boston Scott. You get a bunch of practice squad dudes to the playoffs. You get cheap shot in the back of your head. And then the organization says, we're invested in building around you. And what did they do in the second round? No, first off, they do nothing meaningful in free agency as far as acquiring offensive linemen or wide receivers. But wide receivers was the biggest part because you played with the worst wide receiving core in the league the previous year, rated the worst wide receiving core in the league. And then they proceed after that to draft Jalen Hurts in the second round, thus undermining everything you've done in the locker room, because not only did they draft a quarterback in the second round, but they draft someone that everybody knows. And so now they've reintroduced a quarterback controversy into the equation. In the event that you play bad, now fans are going to be clamoring for Jalen Hurts the minute you play bad. And now we're in the situation we are now. What person do you know that wouldn't be affected by that? All that I just outlined, that whole entire narrative. And people want to continuously tell me that Carson Wentz is soft and he's being all these other things. What guy would not be affected by that? This organization, they send mixed signals. They invite dysfunction. They didn't have to draft Jalen Hurts. They didn't have to do that. But they have this absurd way of thinking that, because we want a Super Bowl with a backup, we need to invest premium assets into having a backup quarterback when everyone and their mom knows if your starter goes down, your season is over. A backup is not leading you to a Super Bowl. Look at the history of the NFL and the past Super Bowl winners absolving Nick Foles the last decade. It's been Patrick Mahomes, a bunch of Tom Brady. Just look at the quarterbacks they've gotten there. A bunch of, Patrick Mahomes, a bunch of Tom Brady, Peyton Manning, Joe Flacco in the AFC. And then it's Drew Brees, Russell Wilson twice, Aaron Rodgers, Jimmy Garoppolo, Nick Foles, Matt Ryan, Eli Manning a couple times. Like, come on. Backups are not getting you to Super Bowls. What do you think? Like, what do you think this is? And so when they do these mind-boggling things, it just doesn't add up. It's a quarterback-starved league. Most teams are looking for a good starter. So if it's a quarterback-starved league and there's only but so many good starting quarterbacks, how many good backups do you think there are? It's like, what are these guys thinking? What are they evaluating about the league? They're behind. These dudes with all these analytics and claim to be forward thinkers, but they have no foresight about their decisions. You had no foresight to know after 16 games whether you wanted to fire Doug Pederson. It took you a week afterwards to do so, and either he self-sabotaged himself, or he actually believed that his internal hires were the right decisions. You have the GM who didn't have the foresight to know when to stop investing in, trying to chase another Super Bowl with this terrible roster and with veterans who weren't performing up to snuff, and instead has backed the organization to a corner where he says change is necessary and inevitable. How do you back yourself into a corner where your roster is old, bad, expensive, and is limited in ways to acquire talent, on top of the fact that you created dysfunction in a quarterback controversy by drafting Jalen Hurts? I say this once again. What would we be talking about right now if Jalen Hurts was not on the roster? We wouldn't have been clamoring for Nate Sudfeld to get in over Carson Wentz. No one in their right mind would have. What are we like? You saw him play. He isn't like an NFL player. Like, what is this? Like, what is this operation that these guys are running that they think is good? What part of this operation? There's no young talent. That's Howie's fault. The roster is old. That's Howie's fault. The roster is expensive. That's Howie's fault. The quarterback controversy, that's also Howie's fault. And limited in ways to acquire talent because of the cap situation, that's also Howie's fault. But yet you hold Doug accountable for that and not Howie? Like, what is this? And then the only thing they can do is recite their resumes, thus trying to mask their current failures with past successes that are far in the rearview mirror. Stop trying to use the Super Bowl as a crutch, because every day that looks more and more like luck. Lightning in a bottle, a magic carpet ride. Because the way you built the roster was not a sustainable way to win. And it looks like more and more luck because you hit on every single free agent decision that you made. Every single free agent decision and trade decision that you made, you hit on it. And that's not a way to sustain success in the NFL. This team had pieces to contend for a while. But when you don't draft well and give the organization some good players and the coaches some good players, this is what happens. This is a 4-win team, and they're sitting up here talking about past successes. What? How does that hold you accountable for what just happened? Where is the accountability for this season? Stop bringing up that you've been to X amount of NFC Championship games and that you've won 35 games over the past 3 seasons, despite the fact that you have a losing record over the last 3 seasons and you've regressed every year. This stuff is idiocy. These guys don't know what they're doing. And this GM, I continuously say he does not know how to build a winning roster. He had opportunities to add impact talent. DeAndre Hopkins, Stephon Diggs, Jalen Ramsey, Robbie Anderson. He didn't get those guys. You wasted draft capital on trades like Jannard Avery and Golden Tate and midseason acquisitions. You lost a high 4th round pick for Jannard Avery and you lost a 3rd round pick for Golden Tate. You've ignored positions like linebacker and safety. They're the worst in the league. You talk about the redundant parts of the roster. You have 3 defensive tackles that are making top 25 money. What in the hell kind of sense does that make? You don't have a quarterback right now. For three of Carson Wentz's 5 years in the league, you've had the worst rated receiving core in the league. His rookie year, his 2019, and this year, your receivers were rated the worst in the league according to Pro Football Focus. And you still yet to draft any meaningful receivers. If you had DK Metcalf and Justin Jefferson right now, the wide receiver position would be solved. But instead you chose JJ Arcega-Whiteside and Jalen Reagor. And let's get to this year, because the scouts, once again, and I referenced this, the scouts told you to draft Justin Jefferson instead of Jalen Reagor and Jeremy Chin in the second round instead of Jalen Hurts. And you went against the scouts. And you are not a football guy. These two dudes that are running this organization right now are not football guys. Howie Roseman is from law school. And Jeffrey Lurie was gift wrapped this hand, or he was not, what are the words I'm looking for? This organization was gift wrapped to him. He doesn't have any football knowledge. He doesn't have any football experience, any football acumen. Yet they want to ignore the people who have football knowledge, football instincts, who know something. These dudes have been around football. Howie Roseman has been around the Eagles organization for 20 years and knows nothing about football. Jeffrey Lurie has been the owner for Lord knows how long. He knows nothing about football. These dudes, they're not qualified. That's why I say this organization is being run into the ground. These dudes, they have no foresight. They have no vision. They're meddling in football affairs when they have no business doing it. Let's get to these other reports. In an article in the Philadelphia Inquirer, it says, Lurie knows as well as anyone about the process and the details because he's part of it intimately. He lobbied for wide receiver J.J. Arcega-Whiteside in the second round of the 2019 draft and got Pederson to go along per sources. Roseman, who wanted Parrish Campbell, must have figured he had no choice but to sign off. A year later, Lurie was on board when Roseman selected Jalen Hurts in the second round per sources, even though Wentz was less than a year from receiving a franchise contract extension and the Eagles had greater needs. It's unclear how the pick affected Wentz, but the process was flawed. Roseman had disregarded scouts' choice of safety Jeremy Chin, and the results were disastrous. The same could be said of Roseman's decision to take his coach's advice over his scouts and draft receiver Jalen Reagor over Justin Jefferson a round earlier. So you have the owner meddling, and he's become, and let's keep this clear. Jeffrey Lurie is a lot closer to Jerry Jones in comparison than we think. He just doesn't have post-game press conferences after games. But he's meddling in football affairs when he has no football knowledge. None. And then you were on board with the Jalen Hurts pick despite 10 months earlier paying Carson Wentz all that money? What are you trying to do? What are you trying to do? Like I said, based off of quotes, it's become clear to me that the Eagles view Jalen Hurts as a backup. So why in the heck would you use a second round pick on a backup quarterback? No one in the league does that. Guys that don't become starters in the league and are eventually recycled, they become backups. The league is always recycling quarterbacks that aren't good enough. And those dudes naturally transition into becoming quality backups. So you don't have to invest a second round pick in a backup. But if you're not smart enough and you have owners meddling in team affairs, signing off on these ridiculous and idiotic moves, and you have the GM ignoring the scouts, the people who are football minds, this is what kind of operation you get. This is dysfunction. How else can you describe it? How else can you describe this? You continue to invest in players or veteran players like Alshon, who if you handed him a pair of Air Jordans, he couldn't jump 2 feet. You invest in old guys like Jason Peters? Like, what is this operation? What is this? These dudes, they don't know what they're doing, yet they're meddling in football affairs. You're the owner. Your job is to cut checks. GM, this is supposed to be a collaborative effort as far as evaluating players, and you're doing your own thing instead of listening to the scouts, especially when you're a dude from law school. These dudes, they don't have the credentials to build a successful franchise. They just don't. These dudes, these guys, they just don't have the credentials or the football knowledge or acumen. They think because they lucked up into winning one Super Bowl, they know what they're doing when they don't. How do you 3 years removed from a Super Bowl become a dysfunctional franchise? Unless you have a bunch of people trying to take credit and do stuff their own way and insert their ego into decisions to prove they're the smartest guys in the room when they're not. You're not. This stuff, it just doesn't make sense. It doesn't make a bit of sense. Like, how can you can't even make an argument. And now this team, I've outlined how you break a franchise. They're old. You relied on veteran players for so long. They're bad. This roster is 4-11-1 with the current players on it. It's expensive. You're $70 million over the cap. You have a quarterback controversy. And you're limited in ways you can acquire talent because you're over the cap. So you can only acquire players through the draft. And you've been terrible at that the last 7 years. And then we get to this quarterback controversy. And how could anyone be sold on Jalen Hurts? This guy completed 52% of his passes, 6 touchdowns, 4 interceptions. A guy that is, if his first read isn't open, he's running. That's not successful in the NFL. There is no franchise quarterback in the NFL currently that is completing 52% of their passes. It's just not happening. And they're not called a franchise quarterback. You look at Jalen Hurts' last 20 drives. This is just really appalling to me. People are sold on this guy as as this guy to supplant Carson Wentz. Jalen Hurts' last 20 drives. Here are the stats. Team points, 17. Completed 25 of 56 passes. A completion percentage of 44.6%. 0 touchdowns, 3 interceptions. Passer rating, 41.2. And those 20 drives are the final 11 drives of Week 16 against the Dallas Cowboys and the first 9 drives of Week 17 against the Washington Football Team, where he completed 7 of 20 passes. What argument could you make that he should be the franchise quarterback? And granted, it's not all his fault because this roster stinks, which is the same things we were saying about Carson Wentz. This passing offense was broken with or without him, and you saw it with Jalen Hurts. He was suffering from the same things Carson Wentz was suffering from. Lack of protection, lack of weapons on the outside. It looked nice for a minute, but he beat a Saints team that was without Drew Brees and had clearly a quarterback who was deficient throwing the football and Taysom Hill playing. So give me a break with that. And a team that wasn't even prepared for him. But as you saw, as teams got film on him, they stopped him. And he looked like a jag, just a guy. If you're the Philadelphia Eagles, in my estimation, you got to get offensive mind in here as the head coach. It really just boils down to that for me. For the life of me, this organization is looking at everybody else's decisions as far as drafting. Are they looking at everybody else's decisions as far as what they do with their young quarterbacks? Are they looking at the Josh Allens, the Baker Mayfields, the Lamar Jacksons, Patrick Mahomes, Dak Prescott's, Kyler Murray, Jared Goff? Are they looking at what those organizations have done for those quarterbacks? Because the only quarterback who's been severely screwed over more than Carson Wentz is Sam Darnold, if we're being completely honest. Because I don't think the Eagles realize that they wouldn't even have a Super Bowl right now if it wasn't for Carson Wentz. Everyone just acts like, oh, Nick Foles did this and he did that. Nick Foles was lucky. Nick Foles has never played. He has never in his life played to the level of the NFC Championship game and Super Bowl performances that he's had after the fact. He went to Jacksonville. He flamed out. He went to Chicago and looked good for a minute, but then got benched for Mitchell Trubisky. I mean, let's just call it what it is. Nick Foles is a backup quarterback. He's not a starter. He's a backup. He's never been able to replicate the success he's had in Philadelphia anywhere else. Never. Everywhere else, he's flamed out to the point where he was debating retirement before the Eagles brought him back in as a backup. But if the Eagles are looking at all these other, if they're looking at all these other franchises and the dudes that they're drafting, why are they not looking at all these other young quarterbacks and what these franchises have done to set them up for success? You look at Baker Mayfield, they give him Jack Conklin, Jedrick Wills, Odell Beckham Jr., they give him Jarvis Landry, Austin Hooper, David Njoku, Nick Chubb, Kareem Hunt. You look at the luxuries that have been afforded to Josh Allen. They give him a number one receiver. Who knew you give a quarterback a number one receiver and he has an MVP year? They give him Stephon Diggs, John Brown, Gabriel Davis. He looks stellar. You give Kyler Murray, DeAndre Hopkins. He looks great. Deshaun Watson came into the league with DeAndre Hopkins. Now, the Texans have severely screwed him over and they're dysfunctional franchise with this guy Esterby and this ownership intact that's severely screwing Deshaun Watson over. So he should want out of there. But you look at what he had before with Will Fuller, DeAndre Hopkins, Carlos Hyde is a 1,000-yard rusher, Kenny Stills. You look at Dak Prescott, they gave him Amari Cooper, CeeDee Lamb, Michael Gallup, Zeke Elliott. You look at Jared Goff, he's had Sammy Watkins, Brandon Cooks, Cooper Kupp, Robert Woods, Todd Gurley. He's got Cam Akers now. Like you look at all these other young quarterbacks, and then you look at what Carson Wentz has been surrounded with: dysfunction, the worst wide receiving core in the league, rated by Pro Football Focus, 3 of his 5 seasons in Philadelphia. I mean, give me a break. This isn't to absolve Carson Wentz. It's his fault that he's played poorly. It's the GM's fault that he's played poorly because he surrounded him with poor pieces. And it's also Doug Pederson's fault as well. But you can absolve Doug and Carson to an extent because they're only playing with the groceries that the GM picked, which are a bad batch of groceries. People would continuously say, "Oh, you got to overcome. You're getting paid all this money." Did Deshaun Watson overcome it? Deshaun Watson had a career year and he couldn't overcome a 4-12 roster that he was surrounded with. Carson Wentz got this team to the playoffs last year, despite the practice squad players that were on it. But it's unfair to ask a quarterback to continuously turn water into wine when you can surround him with help. It's fair to ask your quarterback to carry us for a month. You can't ask your quarterback to carry you for a whole year. Carry you because you've done a poor job surrounding him with talent? That's unfair, even if you paid him. People continuously say, "Oh, well, once you pay the quarterback, you can't surround him with enough talent. Now you can't pay this guy. Now you can't pay that guy." That is where your GM has to be good about drafting quality players. That is where the GM comes into play. Stop blaming the quarterback for taking the money. You have to pay somebody in this league. If you have an elite quarterback, you're not going to let him walk out the door, are you? I mean, these foolish statements that people make, it's just mind-blowing. The stuff that comes out of people's mouths sometimes, it's just dumbfounding. This operation, it's failing. It is literally failing everywhere. The owner and the GM, they're clearly in lockstep because the owner's meddling in team affairs and the GM's acquiescing to them. So I guess that's why his job is safe. And the owner understands the quote unquote process, even though they're not picking good players, but they're identifying players before that they just get chosen before. But isn't that part of your process supposed to be a backup plan? Where is your draft board at? Where is your preparation at? The owner's meddling in team affairs and choosing scrubs like J.J. Arcega-Whiteside over DK Metcalf. Howie's ignoring the scouts, choosing Justin Jefferson, choosing Jalen Reagor instead of Justin Jefferson, and Jalen Hurts instead of Jeremy Chin. This is unbelievable. This is unbelievable. And this is insulting to the fans. This is really insulting because the owner, he didn't know. He gave the press conference and did not hold the GM accountable on any front. And as the fans, how are you supposed to feel when the owner sells you a blob of crap and he's lying and doesn't own up to what's taking place and the aggression of this team and this organization? How are you supposed to feel as a fan? It's just absurd. And now there's more reports that the Eagles are scrambling now because they didn't expect to fire Doug Pederson. So just the lack of preparation and lack of foresight. It just goes into my statement earlier about the fact that after 16 games, you didn't know you wanted to fire the guy or not. That was something you should have been evaluating already. But it makes sense. These dudes, once again, that have no foresight. You ask Howie Roseman about the season. Oh, it's still raw. It's still raw. You have 16 games to watch this trash. You ask the owner. Oh, well, we're behind in our coaching. They're scrambling in their coaching search already. Because you're a week behind all the other teams have interviewed all the prime candidates. No, duh. You're behind. Of course you'd be scrambling. But if you didn't know you wanted to fire the coach, that just proves that you don't know what you're doing. Proves you don't know how to evaluate. And all the other stuff I've outlined proves that you don't know what you're doing. Proves that you're an incompetent owner that meddles and has no football knowledge or football experience. And you're enabling the idiot below you, the GM, Howie Roseman, by commandeering his foolish draft decisions and talking about the process and the players that he evaluated that went 2, 3, 4, 5 picks ahead instead of judging him based off the players that he's chosen. The heck? What kind of naive statements and oblivious statements are these? Too busy looking at other franchises that you're not even being honest about your own. What are the analytics telling you about your organization and the players that you're choosing and your GM? This guy, he's unqualified. I'm done with this owner. I'm done. He's clearly been handed this organization when he was never qualified to have it in the first place. He was clearly just handed this organization like a gift. And what he's done is hand out GM jobs like they're a gift and handed out lifetime jobs to Howie Roseman like he's done something stellar with this job the last 5 years. And all he did was hold the coach accountable, but not the GM. This is a disgrace. And then how they do business with these leaks. This is so disgusting. They should be ashamed of themselves. They do shameful business. Howie Roseman does shameful business. And Jeffrey Lurie, he's just oblivious and in flagrant denial about where this franchise is headed. And he's running this organization into the ground and taking the loyal fans with him. Because our hearts, emotions, and feelings are invested in this city. And this is the it franchise in the city of Philadelphia. Not the Sixers, not the Phillies. The Philadelphia Eagles. This is the it franchise. This is the franchise that is the heartbeat of the city. And the fact that you are stabbing us in the back routinely year after year after year and are asking us to watch this nonsense unfold, it's just mind-boggling. And you can't even be honest about it. You can't be honest about the direction of the franchise. You can't be honest about it. That's the most disheartening part. You're naive and you can't be honest about the shortcomings of your own franchise as the owner. I've never seen anything like this in my life. The GM has left this team bereft of talent, relying on old players. They're 4-11, so they're 4-11-1, so they're bad. They're limited in ways they can acquire talent, and they have a quarterback controversy. And he's saying over here, sitting up here defending the GM, saying he's done a good job, basically. Like, what in the hell kind of sense does that make? That doesn't make a bit of sense. Like, how can you defend these decisions year after year after year? You're talking about J.J. Arcega-Whiteside over DK Metcalf, Deebo Samuel, A.J. Brown, and Terry McLaurin. Those are all dudes who were chosen after J.J. Arcega-Whiteside, not before. You're talking about Jalen Reagor. You chose Jalen Reagor over Justin Jefferson, Brandon Ayuk, T. Higgins, and Chase Claypool. And then you are unwilling to trade up for CeeDee Lamb. You're talking about historic running back class in 2017 with Dalvin Cook, Alvin Kamara, Marlon Mack, Aaron Jones, James Conner, Kareem Hunt, Tariq Cohen, Matt Breida, Austin Eckler, Chris Carson, Joe Mixon, Christian McCaffrey, and Leonard Fournette. And you end up with Donald Pumphrey, a guy who's not in the league anymore. You're talking about your whole 2017 draft class is gone. Except for Derek Barnett, who you drafted him at elite player's price, and he's not an elite edge defender. Sidney Jones and Rasul Douglas were the second and third round picks. They were cut. I just outlined Donald Pumphrey. He was a fourth round pick. Matt Collins and Shelton Gibson, not on the team. Elijah Qualls, like, where did they come on? Then you're talking about Dallas Goedert, he's good. Miles Sanders, they're two good dudes in the second rounds in back-to-back years. But then you get into Avonte Maddox, huh? What? What are we talking about? A 5'9" corner starter on the outside? He's not good. Then you're talking about 2020, Jalen Reagor, Jalen Hurts, Davion Taylor, a guy who who never stood out on his Colorado tape and played a handful of high school games. You're talking about the fourth round, Kayvon Wallace. He couldn't get on the field in Jim Schwartz's scheme for some odd reason. You're talking about in the fifth round, you chose John Hightower and Quez Watkins. And like and then the draft class this year, they try to bamboozle the fans into selling us on this false narrative that they're going to be the Kansas City Chiefs of the NFC with this most athletic draft class according to Next Gen Stats. And this team still looks old, slow on offense and predictable. But this is how they hoodwink you. This is how they get you. They get you all excited. Oh, this team's they're going to have a bunch of speed. They're going to be the Kansas City Chiefs. According to Next Gen Stats, they had the most athletic draft class, and this looks like the same offense. They tell Carson Wentz, oh, we're going to give you good receivers, and you give me fifth and sixth round receivers and a guy who can't run routes, can't separate down the field, and Jalen Reagor, when you could have Justin Jefferson. That's 1,000 yards of offense that you just missed out on. Jalen Reagor had about 396 yards. Justin Jefferson had 1,400. That's 1,000 yards of offense that you could have had on your team. And you're talking about players that you could have picked before? What about the players that you passed on? He would have picked after Jalen Reagor. My gosh. These dudes, when you just look at the premium positions on the Philadelphia Eagles, you tell me how many they have. Quarterback. There's a quarterback controversy there, so we don't know what. I believe we have a quarterback, but according to them, I have to go based off of their prognostications. So, quarterback, we don't know. There's a quarterback controversy right now. Offensive tackle, Lane Johnson. He's getting up there in age. Andre Dillard. First off, he was overdrafted, number one. But number two, he's going in his third year, and we don't know whether he's good or not. That's another first-round pick that's gone to waste so far. Defensive end / pass rusher. Our best pass rusher is Fletcher Cox. Or Brandon Graham, and those dudes are over the age of 30. Derek Barnett, he's not nearly good enough for a first-round pick. Corner, our best corner is over 30. Wide receiver, I don't know who our best wide receiver is going to be going into next year. You're talking about Jalen Reagor, J.J. Arcega-Whiteside, John Hightower, Quez Watkins, and Greg Ward. That wide receiver room is terrible. And then after that, the next position I'd argue is most important is probably safety. Who are your starting safeties? Rodney McLeod has a ACL tear. Jalen Mills, he's not going to be back next year most likely. Kayvon Wallace, he's unproven rookie who didn't get much playing time. So you just look at the premium positions: quarterback, offensive tackle, defensive end, cornerback, wide receiver, safety. What the Eagles are missing, they're missing talent at these positions. That's not getting into the fact that they have no talent at the linebacker spot. But this is what they've done. And the people are telling me the GM's done a stellar job with this operation. So now we get into the point where we talk about solutions. My solution was always very simple. Fire Doug Pederson, fire Howie Roseman, repair Carson Wentz, get him some offensive weapons in the draft. That was my plan. But clearly that whole plan did not come to fruition. But clearly as I've said before, I don't believe Doug and Carson worked together. Reports came out their relationship was fractured, so one of them had to go. Clearly Carson, it looks like he's going to survive and he's going to be the quarterback, most likely. So now the question is, what do you do now? Well, now that we have this number 6 overall pick, what I would do is either A, draft Jamar Chase or Devontae Smith or Jalen Waddle with that number 6 pick. B, after that, you have to run it back with this same offensive line. Lane Johnson's coming back. He's going to be the right tackle. Brandon Brooks is coming back. He's going to be the right guard. Now, whether they hold up 16 games is a whole other issue, but as of right now, I can only go with the information I have. As center, if Jason Kelsey decides to come back, you got your center. If not, you slide Sayamalu over to center. Then at left guard, you put Andre Dillard. And then at left tackle, you put Jordan Mailata, who showed promise near the end of the season. And if not, you can always put Jack Driscoll at left guard, and keep Andre Dillard at tackle on the left side. But that's my recipe for the offensive line as far as the skill positions, players, and what you do with the number 6 pick. As far as coaches, here are the options that I like. Obviously, ideally, Eric Bieniemy would be my number 1 choice, but I'll get to that in a second. Eric Bieniemy, the coaches' names that I have written down: Brian Dable, Lincoln Riley of my Oklahoma Sooners, Nathaniel Hackett, he's the offensive coordinator with the Green Bay Packers, Joe Brady, he's obviously the guy who orchestrated the LSU offense when they won the national championship just last year, and was, the Saints offensive, assistant for a few years before going to LSU. And last year was the offensive coordinator with the Carolina Panthers. So he's an option that I'd like. Graham Harrell, Eagles tried to interview him last year to be an offensive coordinator, but Doug wouldn't relinquish play calling. So that made no sense, obviously. Mike Kafka, QB coach of the Kansas City Chiefs, also former backup for the Philadelphia Eagles. And Robert Saleh, because he's really the only defensive mind I have on here. And that is because he'll bring along Mike LaFleur, Matt LaFleur's brother, with him most likely wherever he lands as a head coach. So, and obviously Matt LaFleur is orchestrating the number 1 offense right now with Aaron Rodgers. So those are the names. Most of those are offensive minds. Of course, Robert Saleh is the only defensive mind. But Jeffrey Lurie obviously wants to have a top 5 offense, so I'm inclined to believe he's going to hire a young, innovative offensive mind. Now, here's where the conflict lies. Are the Eagles going to empower this head coach? Which means Are they going to let him choose his own staff, or are they going to go choosing guys before this guy even gets hired? Now, if they let him choose his own staff, then you let the coach die on his own sword. Or are they going to try to get a young guy that they can control and they can be puppet masters and, oversee and meddle in the entire offensive operation? Because that's essentially what they did with Doug. Doug wanted to bring his offensive staff back last year. He said they were coming back. Then 2 days later, he has to fire Mike Groh and Carson Walsh because Howie and the owner didn't agree with that. Then this year they pushed, Rich Scangarello and Marty Mornawig on him. And when that didn't work out, they fired Doug. I didn't choose those guys. You guys chose those guys. Now I'm at fault because I didn't want to change I wanted to promote internally. So there's that. So if they want a coach that they can, be puppet masters over, that's probably going to be a first time head coach, most likely, or a young head coach. But if they're going to, give someone control of their staff, it's probably going to be someone who's a little bit older that's not, coming from the college ranks. So probably not someone, like Joe Brady. He hasn't had much coaching experience. He's still on the young side. He's only like 30, 31, or Lincoln Riley. Those are guys that they would be puppet masters for. Salah, they probably wouldn't be able to push around like that. Dable, probably not. Kafka, that's probably someone they could push around. Potentially Hackett. Definitely not Bieniemy. They're not going to push him around. They're not going to push around no black man. But those are my suggestions as far as this whole operation is concerned. I'm also not opposed to, if the Eagles end up trading Carson Wentz, just drafting a quarterback, because I've said it, on the other episodes last week. If the Eagles trade Carson Wentz, I fully believe they're going to draft a quarterback. I just don't see why they wouldn't. They're not sold on Jalen Hurts. They're right there picking in the top 6. Teams are going to want to trade up to draft quarterbacks. So that'd be my natural inclination if, they trade Carson Wentz. But I'm under the mindset that now that they've gotten rid of Doug Pederson, that they're going to keep Carson. So there's that. Now, if you've somehow stayed and listened to the end of this podcast at this point, I'm going to offer a proposition. I will give $20 to the first listener that I will give $20 to the first listener that comments the guys' names that I say if they get hired. So if the Eagles hire Eric Bieniemy, Lincoln Riley, or Joe Brady, I will give $20 to the person who leaves all 3 of those names in the comments section under this episode. And I'm only doing that because, number one, those names would very much make me feel good about this whole situation. And number 2, it shows me that you've literally listened to me talk for about an hour and a half. And it shows that you just really love me or the AC podcast, or both. So $20 is on the table right now. And if the Eagles, and you only get it if the Eagles hire Eric Bieniemy, Joe Brady, or Lincoln Riley, and you have to leave all 3 names that I said in the comments section under this episode. So that's the proposition. So you need 2 things to go your way. Well, you only really need there's 3 names to pick from. So you got a pretty decent chance. But yeah. So yeah, you got a pretty good chance. I gave you 3 options. All you got to do is leave those names under the comment section. If one of them gets hired as the next Eagles head coach, I'll send you $20. It's that simple. So that's my proposition for anyone that's listening still at this point. And if you are listening, I appreciate y'all as always. I love y'all as always. One love. Please share this, like it, subscribe it, and I'll catch you guys on the flip side of things. I gave you a lot of information just now. It's tough being an Eagles fan, as you can see, but As always, I'm going to remain loyal to my franchise, remain loyal to my team, and hopefully by some, stroke of luck, they'll hit on these draft picks, maybe. And that's really the only hope I have at this point, because we can't acquire any free agents. So my only hope is that Howie Roseman, by some stroke of luck, breaks his terrible streak of drafting poorly and hits on these draft picks. I don't know how you can possibly miss on the 6th pick in the draft. If you miss on this pick, you are done in Philadelphia. The fans are they're gonna lose their minds if you miss on the number 6 pick. So, because then it's like, what was all that tanking for if you still couldn't pick a good player? So you better get this one right, Howie. We already want you out of here, but if you miss on the 6th pick, yeah, there's going to be a deep, deep fire under your behind by the fans. It don't matter how many leaks that you do either. You're not going to be able to skate from under this. So there's that. But I appreciate you guys for listening. Like, share, subscribe. Like I said, if you want the $20, do what I said. Pray that the Eagles hire one of the dudes that I mentioned as well. And until then, I'll see you when I see you. One love. This is AC. I'm out.